The first snowflake that night wasn't a promise. It was a threat. It fell on the Dakota plains with the weight of a tombstone, heavy and final, burying the world in a silence so deep you could hear your own heartbeat turn traitor in your chest. This was the kind of cold that didn't just bite your skin, it reached inside and tried to freeze your soul solid. And in a lonely cabin, hunched against the wind like a forgotten old man, Clara Boone was already mostly frozen. She moved through her life like a ghost, a whisper in a town called Ash Hollow that had long ago traded its warmth for war monuments and sour memories. Inside, the fire in her hearth was a weak, sputtering thing, much like the hope in her own heart. She was sewing a patch on her dead husband's coat, not because it was torn, but because the motion of the needle was the only thing that felt real anymore. Caleb had been gone 2 winters, stolen by a fever that left nothing behind but a name carved in stone and a hole in her life so vast it echoed with every gust of wind. The town had given up on her. The church invitations stopped. The pitying glances turned to whispers, and the whispers faded into the one thing Clara thought she preferred: silence. But tonight, that silence was different. It was predatory. The wind changed its tune, howling a new and terrible song against the cabin walls. She felt it in the floorboards, a vibration of wrongness that made the hairs on her arms stand up. Wrapping a shawl around her thin shoulders, she grabbed the axe. Wood needed splitting. The storm was getting worse. Out in the biting cold, the world was a swirling vortex of white. Her breath plumed in front of her, a silver ghost she sent out into the darkness. She swung the axe once, the sharp thwack against a log sounding small and pathetic against the roar of the blizzard. She raised it again, and that's when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a low, guttural groan, followed by the sickening drag of dead weight through snow. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. She froze, axe held high, a statue carved from fear. The sound came again, closer this time, punctuated by the sharp snap of a frozen branch. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive quiet. Slowly she turned. Squinting into the blizzard, she saw nothing but a sea of white in the long, dancing shadows cast by her cabin's lantern. Then at the edge of her fence line, a shape, a dark stain against the snow. It moved, and it was crawling toward her. She didn't scream. She didn't run. Some strange, forgotten piece of herself took over, a part of her that hadn't died with Caleb. She simply walked toward it, the axe still clutched in her hand, her breath catching in her throat. There, half buried in a snowdrift, was a man, or what was left of one. He was bare-chested under a ripped buckskin vest, his skin the color of rich copper, his long black hair matted with ice and frozen blood. But it was the thing sticking out of his shoulder that made her stop dead. An arrow. The shaft was snapped in half, but the part buried in his flesh was horribly, undeniably there. Black, crusted blood was frozen to his vest. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. And in that moment, she saw not a savage, not a threat, but a man drowning in a sea of white. He was going to die, right here, on her land. She could turn around, go back inside, and by morning the snow would have erased him completely. No one would ever know. It would be the safe choice, the easy choice. But as he swayed, collapsing forward into the snow, she found herself kneeling, catching him before he fell. He was heavy, a dead weight of pain and freezing flesh. Her touch was the first thing that had been asked of her in 2 years, and as her fingers brushed against the frozen buckskin, she felt something else, something hard and metallic tucked into his belt. It wasn't a knife, it was a sheriff's badge, tarnished and bent, but unmistakable, and it wasn't from Ash Hollow. What in God's name was going on? She whispered, "Come on now," her voice rough from disuse. He didn't respond, but he let her haul him to his feet. The arrow in his shoulder shifted with a wet, tearing sound that made her stomach clench. Somehow she dragged him inside, kicking the door shut against the screaming wind. He collapsed into the chair by the hearth, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Her hands, stained with his blood, moved with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She boiled water, gathered cloth, her mind racing. The man wasn't just a wounded native. He was a lawman, or he was impersonating one. Either way, trouble hadn't just knocked on her door, it had broken it down. As she gently cut away the frozen buckskin, she saw the wound was old. At least a day. Infection was already setting in, a pale, ugly swelling around the arrow shaft. This was no hunting accident. This was an execution that had failed. "You'll need to bite down," she said, holding out a strip of leather. He took it without a word, his jaw clenching like a steel trap. She had to get the arrowhead out. It was a brutal, bloody business. She broke the shaft flush with his skin, then reached behind his shoulder, her fingers slick and trembling, and pushed the barbed head forward until it tore through the front. He let out a single strangled grunt, his body rigid with agony, but he didn't scream. When it was over, she packed the wound with boiled rags and bound it tight. He slumped forward unconscious. She moved him to Caleb's cot, a trespass that felt both wrong and strangely right. As she pulled the quilt over him, the tarnished badge fell from his belt and clattered onto the floorboards. She picked it up. It was from Willow Creek County, 2 territories over. Underneath the name, a number was stamped into the metal. 7. She stared at it, the cold truth washing over her. This man wasn't just in trouble. He was the trouble, and she had just invited him into her home. She sat in her rocking chair, the badge cold in her palm, and listened to the wind claw at her windows. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that whoever had put that arrow in his back wasn't going to stop looking for him, and now they would be coming for her too. Morning brought a fragile light that did little to warm the frozen world. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a landscape of pristine, undisturbed white. But inside Clara's cabin, everything was disturbed. The man, the lawman, lay on the cot, his breathing still shallow but steady. He was alive, for now. Clara stood over him, the badge from Willow Creek County feeling heavy in her apron pocket. It was a secret that burned, a secret that could get them both killed. Why would a lawman from 2 territories over be here, shot with an arrow, half dead in a blizzard? None of it made sense, but there was no time to ponder the mystery. A new sound broke the morning silence, a familiar, rhythmic squeaking. It was Elias Judd's cart. The old trapper was half mad and mostly drunk, but he saw more than anyone in Ash Hollow, and he never, ever visited her. She watched through the window as he pulled his mule to a stop just beyond her fence. He didn't get out. He just sat there, staring at her chimney where a thin curl of smoke was rising. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant someone was alive inside, and Elias knew she hadn't had the will to keep a fire going through the night in 2 years. Her heart pounded. He knew. He had to know something was wrong. She had to get him to leave, to pretend everything was normal. Tucking the badge deeper into her pocket, she pulled her shawl tight and stepped outside. The cold was a physical blow. "Elias," she called out, her voice stronger than she expected. "What brings you out so early?" He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the chimney. "Smoke's different," he grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Smelled heavier, like you're burning something other than pine." She froze. What did that even mean? "Just a bit damp is all," she lied, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. Elias finally turned his gaze to her. His eyes were milky with age, but they were sharp. They missed nothing. "Heard things," he said, ignoring her excuse. "Heard a patrol of soldiers pass through yesterday, headed west. They were asking questions, looking for a man." He paused, letting the words hang in the frozen air. "A federal marshal, number 7. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. It was him. The man on her cot was a U.S. Marshal, and soldiers were hunting him. But why? "They say what he did," she asked, her voice a bare whisper. Elias spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "They said he's a deserter, a traitor, said he killed his own men and ran off with a Lakota war party." He squinted at her, his gaze piercing. "Funny thing, though, the arrow tracks in the snow near my line, they weren't from a war party. They were from a single rider, and the horse was shod. Lakota don't shoe their horses." Twist after twist. He wasn't a deserter hunted by the army. Someone was framing him. Someone wanted him dead and was using the army to do it. Elias knew the story was a lie, and he knew she had the man they were looking for. "You keep that fire going, Clara," he said, his voice dropping low. "But you burn green wood from now on. Makes for thick smoke. Hard for folks to see what's happening inside the house." With a flick of his reins, he turned the cart and squeaked away, leaving Clara standing in the snow, her world tilting on its axis. He wasn't going to turn her in. He was trying to help her. She rushed back inside, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The marshal stirred on the cot. His eyes fluttered open. They were dark, intense, and filled with a pain that went deeper than his wound. He looked at her, then around the small cabin, his gaze sharp and assessing, even in his weakened state. "You!" he rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. "You saved me." Clara just nodded, unable to speak. "My name," he said, pushing himself up on one elbow with a grunt of pain. "It's Chatton." He paused, his eyes locking on hers. "It means falcon." She found her voice. "My name is Clara." He nodded slowly. His eyes drifted to the window, scanning the empty landscape. "They'll be coming," he said. It wasn't a question. "They already are," she replied, her hand instinctively going to the badge in her pocket. "The army thinks you're a traitor." A bitter, humorless smile touched his lips. "The army believes what they're told. It wasn't the army that shot me." Before she could ask, he coughed. A deep, rattling sound, and a fleck of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. He was worse than she thought. But as she moved to help him, his eyes widened, fixed on something over her shoulder. He pointed a trembling finger toward the small framed photograph on her mantelpiece, the one of her and Caleb, taken on their wedding day. "Him," Chayton whispered, his voice filled with a sudden, shocking urgency. "Where did you know him? The man in that picture?" Clara stared, confused. That was my husband, Caleb." Chayton fell back against the pillow, his face pale, his eyes wide with a look of dawning horror. "Caleb," he breathed. "He was the one who betrayed me." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Caleb, her kind, gentle Caleb, a traitor? It was impossible. It was a lie, a fever dream from a dying man. "You're mistaken," she said, her voice shaking. "My husband was a good man, a farmer. He died 2 years ago from the fever." Chayton's eyes, burning with intensity, never left hers. "He didn't die of a fever, Clara," he whispered, his voice laced with a terrible certainty. "I saw him 3 days ago. He was leading the men who left me for dead." The world tilted and went gray. Her cabin, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. Her memories, the last precious things she had, felt like lies. Caleb? Alive? Working with men who would put an arrow in a federal marshal? It couldn't be true. And yet the look in Chatton's eyes held no deception. It held the raw, undeniable truth of a man who had stared death in the face. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. She thought of the whispers in town after Caleb's funeral, the quick, hushed burial, the way Sheriff Crane had handled all the paperwork himself, telling her not to worry her head about it. She'd thought it was kindness. What if it was a cover-up? "Who?" she breathed, the question tearing from her throat. "Who was he with?" Chayton's gaze drifted past her, to the window. His voice was low, each word a heavy stone dropping into the silence of the room. "A man with a silver star on his chest, the sheriff of Ash Hollow. Abel Crane, the righteous, rule-following sheriff. The man who always tipped his hat and spoke of order. He was part of this. He had helped fake her husband's death. But why? What could possibly connect her dead farmer husband, the town sheriff, and a hunted U.S. Marshal?" Before Chatton could say more, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the front door. It wasn't Elias Judd this time. This was the knock of the law. Clara's blood ran cold. It was him. Sheriff Crane was at her door. She looked from the door to Chatton, who was already reaching for something under the cot, his face a mask of grim determination. He was too weak to fight. They were trapped. Crane knocked again, louder this time. "Clara Boone, open up! I know you're in there!" She had to make a choice right now. Trust the dying marshal and the impossible story about her husband, or trust the man on the other side of the door who represented the law she had respected her entire life. She looked at Chayton, at the fierce, unbroken spirit in his eyes, and then at the photograph of Caleb, the man she thought she knew. Her hand closed around the heavy, cold metal of the marshal's badge in her pocket. This was Caleb's badge. Number 7. It wasn't Chatton's at all. Chatton wasn't the marshal. Her husband was, and he was alive. With a deep, steadying breath, Clara walked to the door. She wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. She was a woman with questions that needed answers, and she'd be damned if she let Abel Crane get in the way of them. She opened the door. Sheriff Crane stood on her porch, his face a mask of false concern, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "we've had some folks expressing concern, seeing smoke from your chimney. Thought I'd check you were all right." His eyes flickered past her, trying to get a look inside the cabin. "I'm fine, Sheriff," she said, her voice as cold and hard as the frozen ground beneath her feet. She didn't move. She blocked his view. Crane's smile tightened. He wasn't used to her being anything but meek and broken. "That's good to hear. Thing is, there's talk. Talk you might have taken in astray. A dangerous man." His gaze was like a physical weight, trying to press her into submission. "There's no one here but me," she lied, her heart hammering. "Just an old woman keeping warm." "Is that so?" he said, taking a step closer. "Because I have a tracker says a wounded man came this way, a Lakota man, a wanted man." He was testing her, pushing her. He wanted to see if she would break. "I haven't seen anyone," she repeated, her voice steady. The lie felt surprisingly easy on her tongue. The man inside wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was the only link to the truth about Caleb. Crane's eyes narrowed into slits. The friendly mask was gone. Now all she saw was a predator. "You'd be wise not to lie to me, Clara. Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime, especially when that fugitive is a savage who murdered good, God-fearing men." "And you'd be wise to get off my property, Sheriff," she shot back, the words tasting like fire. The shock on his face was almost comical. He took an involuntary step back. "This is my land," she said, her voice rising with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "My house, and you are not welcome here." For a long, tense moment, they stood locked in a battle of wills, the lawman and the widow. Then a faint sound came from inside the cabin, a muffled cough. Crane's head snapped up, his eyes locking on the cabin door. He knew. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "You've made a terrible mistake, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "I'll be back, and when I return, I won't be knocking." He tipped his hat in a gesture of pure mockery, turned, and walked back to his horse. She watched him ride away, his silhouette dark against the snow. He wasn't just coming back for Chatton. He was coming back to silence the only two people who could expose his secret. She closed the door, her body trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, terrifying rage. She looked at Chatton, who was now sitting up, clutching the wound in his shoulder. "He knows," Chayton said. "I know," she replied. She pulled the badge from her pocket and held it out. "This was my husband's." Chayton's eyes widened as he looked at the tarnished star. "So you believe me?" "I don't know what to believe," she said honestly, "but I believe you saw what you saw. My husband is alive, and the sheriff is protecting him." A new, horrifying thought began to form in her mind. Caleb hadn't been a simple farmer. The badge proved that. He was a U.S. Marshal. He had been living a double life. But why? Why fake his death? Why abandon her? "There's more," Chayton said, his voice weak. He reached into a hidden pocket in his torn trousers and pulled out a small folded piece of oilskin. He handed it to her. "Caleb, Marshal Boone." He dropped this during the ambush. Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was a map. A crude, hand-drawn map of the area around Ash Hollow. Several locations were circled in red. Her cabin was one of them. Another was an old, abandoned silver mine up in the hills. And a third was a spot deep in the Badlands marked with a single, chilling word: cash. But it was the writing on the back of the map that made her blood run cold. It was Caleb's handwriting, neat and precise, just as she remembered it. It was a list of names. Sheriff Abel Crane was at the top. Below him were Thomas Reeve and a half-dozen other prominent men from Ash Hollow, the town council, the business owners, the men who ran everything. And next to each name was a number, a payment. It was a ledger, a record of bribes. Her husband wasn't just a marshal living a secret life. He was a corrupt marshal, and the entire leadership of Ash Hollow was in on it with him. They hadn't just faked his death to protect him, they had faked his death to protect themselves. Chayton saw the look on her face. What is it? It's a ledger, she whispered, the map shaking in her hand. They're all criminals. The whole town. The fever that had supposedly killed Caleb, it hadn't been a fever at all. It was an excuse, a story cooked up to make a federal marshal disappear, so he and the town's leaders could continue their illegal operation, whatever it was. And Chatton, he wasn't a traitor the army was hunting. He was likely the one sent to investigate Caleb. That's why they had to kill him. He was the one man who could expose them all. The mine, Chayton rasped, pointing a weak finger at the map. The old Blackwood mine. That's where they took me. That's where the ambush happened. He coughed again, a racking spasm that left him breathless. The cash, it's gold. Army payroll gold. They didn't steal it from a train. They stole it from their own men, the ones they murdered. The story Elias Judd had told her, the soldiers looking for a deserter who killed his own men. It was the truth, but they had the wrong man. It was Caleb. Her husband was a murderer and a thief. The silence that followed was broken by the distant sound of a ringing bell from town. It was the church bell. But it wasn't ringing for Sunday service. It was ringing fast and frantic. It was an alarm, a call to arms. Sheriff Crane wasn't waiting. He was coming back now, and he was bringing the whole town with him. Clara ran to the window. In the distance, she could see them, a dark line of men moving across the snow. Some on horseback, some on foot. They were carrying rifles and torches. Crane hadn't just lied to her. He had lied to everyone. He had told them there was a murderous savage in her cabin. He had turned her neighbors into a lynch mob. They weren't just coming to kill Chatton. They were coming to burn her to the ground to hide their sins. The mob was a terrifying sight, a black centipede crawling across the endless white, its burning torches held high like venomous fangs. They weren't her neighbors anymore. They were a single entity, a beast fueled by the sheriff's lies and their own simmering fears. Clara looked at Chayton. He had struggled to his feet, his hand pressed against his bleeding shoulder, his eyes blazing with a defiant fire. He was a warrior, even when half dead, but they couldn't fight a whole town. The root cellar, she said, her mind racing. It's small, but the door's reinforced. We can hide. Chayton shook his head, a grim set to his jaw. They have torches. They'll burn the cabin down around us. We'd be cooked alive. He was right. There was no hiding. Her eyes darted around the small room, searching for an answer, a weapon, anything. They landed on Caleb's old hunting rifle, mounted above the hearth. It hadn't been fired in 2 years. She didn't even know if she remembered how to load it. But it was better than nothing. As she reached for the rifle, her fingers brushed against the mantelpiece, knocking the framed photo of her and Caleb to the floor. The glass shattered. She knelt to pick it up, and that's when she saw it. The back of the wooden frame was loose. Prying it open with trembling fingers, she found a hidden compartment. Tucked inside was a small, flat tin box. It wasn't Caleb's. The initials engraved on the lid were E. J. Elias Judd. What on earth? She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, intricately fletched arrowhead. The fletching was made from the feathers of a snowy owl, and the shaft was wrapped in distinctive red thread. It was identical to the broken piece of the arrow she had pulled from Chayton's shoulder. A note was folded beneath it. The handwriting was Elias Judd's, a messy, looping scrawl. It read, Crane's father was a monster. This is the proof. He used these to kill the Lakota family who originally owned this land. Crane keeps a set to honor him. If you're reading this, it means Crane has come for you, and I am too old or too dead to stop him. Use it well. The truth hit her with the force of a physical impact. This wasn't just about stolen gold. This was older, deeper. Sheriff Crane wasn't just a corrupt lawman. He was the son of a murderer, following in his father's bloody footsteps. And Elias Judd, the half-mad old trapper, had known all along. He had been watching, waiting. He had left this here for her, a final, desperate message in a bottle. "This land," Chatton whispered, his eyes fixed on the arrowhead. He had seen it. "My grandmother's family lived on this land. They were killed, massacred. They said it was a rival tribe, but we never believed it." It all clicked into place. The ambush, Caleb, the gold, the sheriff. It was all connected to this single patch of earth. Crane's father had murdered Chatton's ancestors for this land. Now Crane was trying to murder Chatton to keep the secret buried. Caleb must have stumbled into this hornet's nest, gotten greedy, and thrown in with Crane. The stolen gold was just the latest chapter in a story of greed and murder that spanned generations. The roar of the mob was closer now. They were in her yard. "Clara, send out the savage." It was Thomas Reeve, the store owner, his voice dripping with self-righteous fury. She looked at Chatton, the arrowhead clutched in her hand. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was hers. They had killed his family on her land. They had used her husband and turned him into a monster. They had turned her home into a hunting ground. "They want a savage," she said, her voice low and trembling with a rage she had never known. "Let's give them one." She grabbed the rifle. Chayton took Caleb's skinning knife from the wall, his movements slow but deliberate. They weren't going to hide. They weren't going to run. They were going to make their stand. Right here. She took a deep breath and threw open the door, stepping out onto the porch. She held the unique, owl-feathered arrowhead high for all to see. The mob fell silent. They stared, confused. Then a gasp rippled through the crowd. Some of the older men recognized it. They had seen arrows like that before, decades ago, in the hands of the man who had founded their town. "You know this arrow!" she shouted, her voice ringing out in the cold air, clear and strong. "You know who used it. It was Sheriff Crane's father." A nervous murmur spread through the crowd. They looked from her to Crane, who had gone pale. "She's lying!" Crane roared, his composure cracking. "She's a witch, consorting with a murderer." But the seed of doubt had been planted. Her words had broken the mob's single-minded fury. They were individuals again, men with memories, men with consciences. "This man," Clara continued, pointing to Chatton, who now stood beside her, a silent, imposing figure. "His family was murdered for this land, by Crane's father. The gold my husband stole with your sheriff was just a down payment on a debt of blood." She was weaving it all together, the past and the present, the lies and the truth. She held up the map, the ledger. "Your town is built on a lie. Your sheriff is a murderer, just like his father before him. He's been using you, all of you." "Enough!" Crane screamed, his face purple with rage. He raised his rifle, pointing it not at Chayton, but directly at Clara. "I should have gotten rid of you years ago." Time seemed to slow down. The faces in the crowd were a blur of shock and indecision. This wasn't what they had signed up for. They had come to destroy a monster, but now they were watching their own sheriff about to gun down a widow in cold blood. Before Crane could pull the trigger, a voice cut through the tension. "Put it down, Abel." Elias Judd stepped out from behind the crowd. He wasn't alone. Behind him was the young deputy, Jacob Heron, his face pale but resolute, his own rifle aimed squarely at the sheriff. "It's over," Elias said, his voice calm and steady. "They know. Everybody knows." The spell was shattered. The mob began to back away, their torches suddenly looking shameful in the daylight. They stared at Crane with dawning horror, realizing they had been the pawns in his bloody game. Crane was trapped. His lies were exposed, his power gone. His eyes darted around, wild and desperate. He was a cornered animal. Then he did something no one expected. He smiled, a terrifying, empty smile. "If I'm going down," he hissed, "I'm taking you all with me." He swung his rifle away from Clara and fired directly into a pile of dry firewood stacked against her cabin wall. The wood exploded into flame. The dry timber of the cabin caught instantly. Fire raced up the walls with a hungry roar. Panic erupted. The mob scattered, shouting and screaming as the flames leaped toward the sky. Crane used the chaos, leaping onto his horse and galloping away, disappearing into the trees like a devil into the night. The cabin was an inferno. The heat was immense, driving them back from the porch. In moments, the roof would collapse. Everything she had, the last remnants of her life with Caleb, her home, it was all turning to ash. But as she stood there, watching the flames consume her past, she didn't feel loss. She felt a strange, fierce sense of release. Chayton grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the blistering heat. "It's gone," he said, his voice low. Elias and Jacob ran towards them. "He's headed for the old Blackwood mine," Jacob panted. "He must be going for the gold." Clara looked from the burning embers of her home to the dark line of hills where the mine lay hidden. This wasn't over. Crane had the gold. And somewhere out there, her husband Caleb, the man who had started all of this, was still alive. "He won't get away," she said, her voice hard as steel. She looked at Chatton, at Elias, at the young deputy. They weren't a mob anymore. They were a posse, and they were going hunting. Justice for Ash Hollow wasn't going to come from a courtroom. It was going to come from them. The fire raged, a funeral pyre for Clara's old life. The townsfolk who had come to burn her out now stood in the stunned silence, their torches useless against the inferno. They watched as the roof of the cabin collapsed with a deafening roar, sending a shower of glowing embers into the winter sky. They had been lied to, manipulated, and very nearly turned into murderers. The shame was a bitter taste in their mouths. Thomas Reeve, the storekeeper, who had been the loudest voice in the mob, couldn't meet Clara's eye. He simply turned and walked away, the others following like a flock of guilty sheep. Clara felt nothing for them. Her gaze was fixed on the plume of smoke rising from her home, a dark column against the pale sky. Everything she owned was gone. But as the last wall crumbled into glowing ruin, she realized the fire hadn't taken anything that truly mattered. It had burned away the ghost she had become, leaving behind someone new, someone forged in betrayal and tempered by righteous anger. "We need horses," she said, her voice cutting through the crackle of the flames. Jacob Heron nodded. "We can get them from the livery. No one will stop us now." They moved with grim purpose. The ride to the Blackwood mine was fast and brutal. The wind was a razor, whipping snow into their faces. Chatan rode beside her, his face a stoic mask, but she could see the pain in the tight set of his jaw. He shouldn't be riding, not with his wound, but she knew nothing could stop him. This was more than just retrieving stolen gold. This was about reclaiming a stolen history. Elias Judd, surprisingly agile for a man his age, kept pace, his old rifle resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. He had been waiting for this day for a long time. They found Crane's horse tied haphazardly to a tree near the mine entrance. The animal was lathered and shaking, a testament to the sheriff's panicked flight. The entrance to the mine was a dark, gaping maw in the side of the mountain, exhaling a breath of cold, damp air that smelled of wet rock and decay. "He's in there," Jacob whispered, dismounting and pulling his rifle. "And he won't be alone." Clara's heart tightened. Caleb. He had to be in there with him. The final confrontation she both craved and dreaded was just a few feet away in the darkness. "He'll be expecting us to come through the front," Chatton said, his voice low. He pointed towards a narrow, almost invisible path that snaked up the side of the mountain. "There's a ventilation shaft up there, leads to the main chamber. We can get the drop on them." It was a risky climb, especially for a wounded man, but it was their only advantage. Elias nodded in agreement. "Good thinking. The boy and I will make some noise out front. Draw their attention. You two go in quiet." Clara and Chayton began the treacherous climb. The rock was slick with ice and the path was barely a foothold. Chatton moved with a hunter's grace, seemingly immune to the pain from his shoulder. Clara followed, her body fueled by adrenaline. All she could think about was seeing Caleb's face. What would she say? What would she do to the man who had shattered her life, her memories, her very identity? They reached the ventilation shaft, a rusted grate covering a dark, vertical drop. Chayton pried it open with the tip of his knife. "It's about a 15-foot drop," he whispered. "I'll go first. I'll break your fall." Before she could protest, he slipped through the opening and disappeared into the blackness. She heard a soft thud, followed by his quiet voice. Come. Taking a deep breath, she followed, landing in his arms. They were in a narrow tunnel. In the distance, they could hear voices echoing, bouncing off the damp rock walls, and they could see the flicker of lantern light. They crept forward, their footsteps muffled by the dirt floor. The voices grew louder. It was Crane and another man, Caleb. They peered around a corner into a large cavernous chamber. Wooden beams, slick with moisture, strained to hold up the ceiling. In the center of the chamber, Crane and another man were frantically stuffing canvas sacks with gold bars from a stack of open army chests. And the other man, it was Caleb, her husband. He was thinner, his face etched with lines of greed and paranoia, but it was him. He was alive. The sight of him sent a wave of nausea through her. This wasn't the man she had married. This was a stranger, a ghoul wearing her husband's face. Hurry up, Crane snapped, his voice shrill. They'll be here any minute. I'm going as fast as I can, Caleb shot back, his voice unfamiliar, rougher. Maybe if you hadn't lost your nerve and set the whole world on fire, we wouldn't be in this mess. She recognized the arrow. The old man must have told her. Crane spat. It doesn't matter. Once we have the gold, we disappear. They'll never find us. Suddenly, a gunshot echoed from the mine entrance. Elias and Jacob were making their move. Crane and Caleb both spun around. Rifles raised, their faces pale in the lantern light. They're here, Caleb yelled. That was their moment. Chayton stepped out from the shadows, the skinning knife held ready. It's over, Crane, he said, his voice a low growl that echoed through the chamber. Crane whirled around, his eyes wide with shock and terror. He saw Chatton, and then he saw Clara stepping out behind him, Caleb's old rifle held steady in her hands. Caleb froze. His eyes locked on Clara's, and for a moment, the greedy stranger vanished, and she saw a flicker of the man she once loved. His face crumpled in a mixture of shock, guilt, and disbelief. Clara? He whispered, his rifle lowering slightly. Why, Caleb? She asked, her voice cracking with the weight of 2 years of grief and a day of unimaginable truth. Why? Before he could answer, Crane made his move. He wasn't surrendering. He shoved Caleb towards them, using him as a shield, and fired his pistol. Chayton pushed Clara down, the bullet whining past her head and ricocheting off the rock wall. Caleb stumbled, caught off guard, and fell to the ground. Crane scrambled for the sacks of gold, abandoning his partner without a second thought. Chayton lunged, not at Crane, but at a thick wooden support beam near the chamber's entrance. He slammed his body into it with all his might. The rotting wood groaned, splintered, and then cracked. The tunnel behind Crane began to collapse. Rocks and dirt rained down, blocking the exit. Crane was trapped. He turned, his face a mask of pure feral rage, and charged back towards them, firing his pistol wildly. From the other end of the tunnel, Elias and Jacob appeared, their guns blazing. A bullet from Jacob's rifle caught Crane in the leg. He screamed and went down, his pistol clattering across the floor. It was over. The chamber fell silent. The only sounds the drip of water and Crane's pained whimpers. Elias and Jacob secured the wounded sheriff while Clara walked slowly towards Caleb, who was still on the ground, staring up at her. I can explain, he stammered, scrambling backwards. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Crane, he had a hold on me. The gold. It was too much. His excuses were pathetic, empty words. The man she had loved was gone, if he had ever existed at all. He was weak and craven, and had let his greed consume him. You let me grieve for you, she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. You let me wither away in that cabin while you were out playing monster. She looked down at him, not with hate, but with a profound and liberating pity. You are nothing, she said. Chayton came to stand beside her. He looked down at the pathetic man on the floor, the man who had betrayed him, who had helped steal his people's legacy. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a silent, powerful judgment. The weight of his stare was more damning than any verdict. Caleb broke. He curled into a ball, sobbing, a broken man who had lost everything because he wanted too much. Clara turned her back on him. She didn't need an apology. She didn't need an explanation. She just needed to walk away. She looked at Chayton. In his eyes, she saw not just gratitude, but a shared understanding. They were both survivors of the same storm. They had both lost their pasts, but they had found something else in the wreckage. As they led their prisoners out of the mine, Crane snarling, Caleb weeping, they were met by a sight that stopped them in their tracks. The men of Ash Hollow were there, all of them. They had followed, not as a mob, but as a silent procession of witnesses. They lined the path from the mine, their faces grim, their hats in their hands. They watched as Clara, Shatton, Elias, and Jacob emerged from the darkness, bringing the town's rotten secrets into the light. No one said a word, but in their eyes Clara saw a new, fragile respect. It was the beginning of an apology, the first step towards healing a town that had almost destroyed itself. The snow had started to fall again, but this time it felt different. It felt like a cleansing. It wasn't bearing the past anymore. It was giving them a clean slate on which to build a new future. In the days that followed, the truth settled over Ash Hollow like the quiet snow. Captain Lawrence Dell, the army man Elias had spoken of, arrived with a contingent of soldiers. He wasn't there to hunt Shatton. He was there to arrest a corrupt sheriff and a disgraced marshal. He listened intently as Clara, Shatton, and Elias told him the whole sordid story, from the generations-old land theft to the stolen army payroll. The ledger from the back of the map was the final nail in the coffin for the town's corrupt leadership. One by one, they were rounded up, their protests silenced by the damning evidence against them. Caleb and Crane were taken away in chains, their destination a federal prison from which they would never return. Clara watched them go, feeling not a shred of sadness for the man she had once called her husband. He was a ghost, and she was finally free of him. The stolen gold was recovered from the mine and returned to the army. Captain Dell, a man of quiet integrity, made a formal declaration. The land, her land, had been stolen. He presented Shatton with a new deed, officially recognizing his ancestral claim. The land didn't belong to the town or to Clara, but to him and his people. Shatton stood on the porch of the temporary cabin the townsfolk had built for Clara, the deed in his hand. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding a question. "This is your home now," he said. "By law." She shook her head, a small smile on her face. "A piece of paper doesn't make a home. People do." The people of Ash Hollow, humbled and ashamed, tried to make amends. They brought her food, lumber, and supplies. They offered silent nods of respect instead of whispers of pity. Young Jacob Heron was appointed the new temporary sheriff, and under his and Elias Judd's guidance, the town began the slow, painful process of rebuilding its soul. One evening, as the sun set, casting long purple shadows across the snow, Chayton found Clara by the ashes of her old cabin. She was standing where the hearth used to be. "I was thinking of leaving," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Going north, trying to find what's left of my people." Clara's heart sank, but she kept her face neutral. "They would be lucky to have you." He was silent for a long moment, watching the colors fade from the sky. "I was a scout," he said. "I was always looking ahead, at the trail, at the enemy. But since that night, since you pulled me from the snow, I've started looking beside me." He turned to face her. The wind gently tossed a strand of her hair across her face, and he reached out, tucking it behind her ear. His touch was warm, gentle. "What do you see?" she whispered. "I see a woman who faced down a mob for a stranger," he said, his voice soft. "I see a warrior who lost everything but her own strength. I see a home." He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "I don't want to go north alone, Clara. The land is mine, but it's just dirt and trees without you on it." Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of hope. She had thought her story ended with Caleb's death, but she was wrong. That was just the prologue. Her real story began the night she chose to save a life instead of closing her door. It began with an arrow, a lie, and a fire that burned everything away to reveal the truth. "So," she said, her voice thick with emotion, a genuine smile spreading across her face, "what do we build first?" And so, on the land that had seen so much bloodshed and sorrow, something new began to grow. Not just a new cabin, built with the help of a repentant town, but a new life, built on a foundation of courage, truth, and the unlikely bond between a grieving widow and the warrior she saved. They were two broken souls who, together, had become whole. They had faced the worst of humanity and had not only survived, but had triumphed. Their story became a quiet legend in that corner of the plains, a reminder that even in the harshest winter, hope can take root, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are not made of gold, but of the choices we make when the world has given us every reason to give up. The world is full of monsters, and sometimes they wear a friendly face or even a sheriff's badge. But it's also full of heroes, and they're often found in the quietest, most forgotten places. Clara Boone taught her town, and all of us, that you don't need a rifle or a fast horse to be strong. You just need the courage to open your door, to stand for what's right, and to fight for the truth, even if it burns your whole world down. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, and you want to hear more tales that dig up the secrets the world tries to bury, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an adventure into the dark. Thanks for watching.